So the struggle for freedom in Africa was perfidiously betrayed by our own leaders. And that is why I say that, Africa is poor because she's not free. We never got our independence. We never got our freedom. And that is political freedom. We never got it. Neither did we get economic freedom, which is very important.
Welcome to the Acton Vault podcast, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Gabriel Jaja, producer. In this episode, we bring you an insightful conversation between Michael Matheson Miller, Acton Institute Senior Research Fellow and producer of the documentary Poverty, Inc., and the late George Ayittey, Ghanaian economist, author, and president of the Free Africa Foundation. The Acton Institute's Poverty Cure series includes supplementary conversations with renowned scholars, business people, and nonprofit leaders. This is a conversation that took place in 2020. Ayittey died on January 28, 2022, at the age of 76. You can find additional resources in the show notes of this episode, as well as previous episodes on our website at acton.org/podcast. If you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Vault is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Michael Matheson Miller, a senior research fellow at the Acton Institute, and welcome to the Poverty Cure Summit. I'm very delighted to have in this conversation Professor George Ayittey. He is originally from Ghana. He's the president of the Free Africa Foundation in Washington, D.C. He's a former professor at American University, a senior fellow and a senior fellow at the Independent Institute and a associate scholar at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He's the author of a number of books, including Africa Unchained, Indigenous African Institutions, Defeating Dictators, and the subtitle, Fighting Tyrants in Africa and Around the World. So, Professor Ayittey, thank you very much for joining Acton's Poverty Cure Summit and for your participation in the Poverty Cure project, Poverty Inc., so many years ago.
Oh, thank you very much for having me again.
Well, I'd like to talk to you today about a couple of things: the informal economy, what it is, and why it can play an important role in African economic growth. And
Sure.
if we have some time, we can talk about some of your work on indigenous African institutions. But first, I'd like to start with one of the core themes of your work. Now, if you look up George Ayittey and you see, look you up, it'll always say a line that you say, which is, Africa is poor because she is not free. So what I'd like to do is talk about that. What do you think are some of the biggest misunderstandings about, say, poverty and wealth, and this kind of theme of your work that Africa is poor because she is not free?
Well, I think there's a great deal of misconception about independence in Africa. There are a lot of people who think that just because African countries became independent, they automatically became free. But the facts on the ground show that true freedom never really came to much of Africa. All that we did at independence was to trade one set of masters, white colonialists, for another set of masters, black neo-colonialists. And the oppression and exploitation of the African people continued unabated. I mean, a typical example was Zimbabwe, where, the white colonialists were replaced by, Mugabe. For example, Mugabe is the least paradigm of freedom in Africa. And we had similar examples across the continent. In Ghana, my own country, where we had Kwame Nkrumah, who came into power in 1957. And then, in fact, many people remember that, during the struggle for colonial rule, the African nationalist leaders demanded democracy. But it was one of the rallying cry of independence. But then after they gained independence, all of a sudden they changed their tune. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, for example, argued that democracy was an imperialist dogma being foisted on the African people. And Daniel Arap Moi of Kenya said that democracy was a luxury Africa could not afford. In 1990, there were only 4 African countries that were democratic. 1990, that was 30 years after independence. In fact, today, only 17 out of the 54 African countries are democratic. So the struggle for freedom in Africa was perfidiously betrayed by our own leaders. And that is why I say that, Africa is poor because she's not free. We never got our independence. We never got our freedom. And that is political freedom. We never got it. Neither did we get economic freedom, which is very important, nor did we get intellectual freedom, freedom of expression. For example, Article 9 of Africa's own Charter of Peoples and Human Rights guarantees freedom of expression, but it is not respected in many African countries. So we don't have freedom of expression, intellectual freedom. In fact, for most of the post-colonial period, you write something which an African government or leader doesn't like, and poof, you are either dead or you are in jail. Now, economic freedom never came to much of Africa. The reason why I'm stressing this is because if you go into traditional Africa, we had economic freedom there. We had freedom of expression there. Oh, people can disagree with the chief or the king, but nobody is going to sort of arrest you and throw you in jail. In economic freedom, you go into the market and you bargain freely over market prices. You can set up your own business or occupation. You can become a fisherman. You can become a farmer, a hunter, or a craftsman. You didn't have to line up before a chief's hut for permission to engage in any kind of trade that you want. All these freedoms were in traditional Africa, but then after independence, they were snatched from the African people.
Professor Ayittey, thanks you. Tell me a little bit about economic freedom. I've heard you talk about this before. What was the situation in Africa after colonialism with economic freedom? What actually happened? It was a departure, you say, from a tribal understanding into a quite planned economic models. Could you talk a little bit about what happened post-colonial Africa and in the economic sphere?
Yes, it's very important because in pre-colonial or traditional Africa, free enterprise, free trade, and free markets prevailed. You could set up a business, any kind of business that you wanted. You can become a goldsmith. You can become a farmer. You can grow any crops that you want. You can be a musician. You can be a fisherman. You can be anything that you want. You did not need the permission or the permit of the tribal government. That's what I mean by free enterprise. And when you produce anything, you can go to a free village market. You can sell your goods, products. You didn't need permission again from the tribal government. And if you go to a market right now in Africa, you see that market activity has been dominated by women. It's been so for centuries. And whenever you want to buy anything, prices are not fixed by the tribal government. You can bargain over prices freely. And if you produce anything, you can sell it on whatever market that you want. There were regional markets in Africa: Kano, Salaga, Mombasa, Timbuktu. All these were great big market towns in the past. Now, as far as, trade is concerned, you can trade with anyone that you want. I mean, before the colonialists came, there was the Trans-Saharan Free Trade Route. Trade routes crisscross the continent, along which people and goods move freely. All these things were there, institutions were there in Africa before the colonialists came. But then after independence, all of a sudden, the leaders decided they went abroad and copied all sorts of Marxist ideas and then deprecated free enterprise as capitalism. And then these leaders all of a sudden decided to assume ownership of the means of production in Africa. The means of production in traditional Africa was never owned by the tribal government. If you go to Africa, in fact, even land was not owned by the tribal government. But then all of a sudden, the government, the main central government, took possession of the means of production and started planning the economy with socialist ideologies on the African people. And that's why things started going so wrong.
So what would be some examples? I mean, I know, like, for example, I know there were fixed prices with coffee or cocoa. Could you give some examples of what were the things that happened post-colonial, right, after independence, where economic freedom was restricted?
Well, after independence, African governments started planning the economies and decided which crops peasant farmers could produce, where they could sell them. The way it took place in Tanzania, where they set up a villagization program and moved peasant farmers into government-owned, government-constructed villages or communes and determined for them what crops they could produce and at what prices they could sell. This was never part of Africa's own traditional systems. Now, this kind of social planning became commonplace across Africa. In Ghana, the government started controlling the prices of many commodities and crops. Market women, I mean, it got out of hand in the 1980s when more than 900 commodities, the prices of more than 900 commodities were controlled. Now, during the 1980s, in the heydays of the Rawlings Revolution, you even have price controllers, price inspectors went to markets, and any market woman who had violated price control laws had her head shaved and stripped naked and often caned. These were brutal policies, and where they were ordered, market women were ordered to reduce their prices. When they refused to do so, you had Air Force personnel go to the markets and destroy their markets, sometimes burning down their markets. Now, African chiefs never did this kind of brutal policies towards their people.
I want to move to the press for a second, but I think one was an interesting thing that maybe you could help explain this, that I learned about even prices with arbitrage. So that, say, like a farmer or a market woman would, like, say, farmers would have to sell their coffee or cocoa at a market price, at a fixed price, but then it would go to the international markets, and then, say, the government or certain officials or companies would make the money on the arbitrage. Do I understand that correctly? So that in a sense that there was profiteering going on with the government, and that was actually hurting the smaller farmers and small merchants.
Well, this was the policy of the marketing boards. I mean, you take the cocoa marketing board, for example. where the government owned the cocoa marketing board, and the price of cocoa was something like, I'm just using an example, say $800 per ton on the international market. And the government will pay the cocoa farmers in Ghana a producer price of, say, $200 per ton. Now, the argument back then was that the difference would be used for the development of the entire country. Mm-hmm. So in other words, it was some kind of a development levy that the cocoa farmers were paying. But then over time, this producer price was never adjusted. It was eaten away by inflation. Now, in other countries, the case in Ghana was that the farmers found that there were no adjustment in the cocoa producer price for as long as 20 years. And after 20 years, they found out that, the producer price in real terms was worth nothing. Mm. So the farmers started to switch from producing cocoa to other crops. So Ghana found out that its production of cocoa over time was dwindling. In the 1950s, for example, Ghana produced something like 200,000 tons of cocoa. By the 1980s, it was producing only 70,000 tons of cocoa. Hmm. Now, in other countries, such as Ivory Coast, the farmers discovered that although the producer price of cocoa was very low and the government was raking the top off for development levy, the government was not using the money that it collected for the development of the entire country. Instead, the elites were using the money to develop the urban areas for themselves and neglecting the rural areas where the cocoa farmers were. For example, it was discovered that in Ivory Coast, for example, 70% of the entire development of Ivory Coast was concentrated around Abidjan, where the elites lived. So that got many farmers angry. And so they were angry not only in Ivory Coast, but also in Ghana. In Gambia, for example, it was the same thing that they discovered. Those who grew peanuts for export discovered that they were paying taxes, exorbitant taxes, almost twice as high as the taxes elsewhere, even in the world, because of the marketing prices. The marketing prices that the peanut farmers received was about 1/3 the world market price for peanuts, which means that the government took 2/3 of it for development. But then the development never benefited the peanut growers or farmers. He had the same situation along West African coast, and that was why cash crop export production started to dwindle in West Africa.
Right, so the incentives weren't there. Peter Bauer was one of the early critics of aid, in the 1980s, kind of alone. I think it was good news that Angus Deaton, in his book, The Great Escape, one of the last chapters, kind of re-articulates Bauer's critique of planning economies. And he actually was talking specifically more about aid here, but I think there's a parallel where he said that what would happen is that foreign aid would politicize development, and it would kind of center everything around a political class. And it seems that you're saying the same thing would happen with, say, internal government plans that were supposed to create a development levy. It actually got captured by the elite kind of urban areas, and the rest of the people were left out. Do you think that's a good parallel, or?
Oh, yes, it's a very good parallel. And it's the same thing with foreign aid. Foreign aid goes straight into the government controlled by the elites, and they determine what kind of development projects they wanted. And the development projects that they wanted were those that benefited them, not necessarily those that benefited the poor. For example, the amount of foreign aid that goes into Africa every year, it's about $34 billion. But then if you look at Africa's begging bowl, it leaks very horribly. In other words, $34 billion goes into Africa's begging bowl. But you have rampant corruption. And you have capital flight. Corruption alone costs Africa $148 billion a year. Capital flight out of Africa. By capital flight, I mean money being taken out of Africa by the same elites. It's about $80 billion. And then you look at food imports. The amount of food that comes into Africa every year is almost about $30 billion. Now, if you add up all these leakages, it's more than $200 billion a year. So Africa really doesn't need aid at all. The aid resources that Africa needs can be found in Africa itself. But then, sometimes I blame the Western donors because they're giving aid to Africa out of their guilt for colonial iniquities and slave trade. But then the aid doesn't really get to the people who need it. It doesn't get to the poor. What the poor needs, not really handouts, but really a hand up. Like they need schools, they need healthcare, they need roads, they need clean water. But if you look at these basic social services, it's always, lacking in many African countries. This especially became clear during the coronavirus pandemic. You look at a country like Zimbabwe. For the entire country of Zimbabwe, they had only 50 hospital beds. It shows you that the modern healthcare infrastructure has literally collapsed in many countries in Africa because the ruling elites neglected them.
Yeah, and that a lot of one of the things I think about, and maybe you can comment on this or critique it, is that oftentimes, like we talk about healthcare or education infrastructure, but what else really helps build that is more than aid is like a commercial society where the local communities are collecting taxes, being able to build their own structures, and then when you rely upon kind of external aid, it's that it gets captured by the elites, as you articulated. And so it seems to me like a better focus for assistance would be helping to kind of create these foundations whereby the commercial society can develop. Well, what would you say to that? Do you think that's wrong? Do you think I'm missing something?
Well, I think, you are very correct in the sense that, the challenge is really how to bypass the elites, the ruling elites, and then see how we can either go directly to the needy, the people who need the aid, or try and find a way by which we can commercialize the provision of clean water, electricity, and healthcare, so that the poor will be able to, I think, gain access to it. The poor really doesn't need. The poor are willing to pay for services if they are there, but it's just that the elites stand in the way of the provision of these services, and they insist on government provision of these services. But then, government provision of these services, really, you and I know that it goes really to the elites and not to the poor. The challenge is to find ways by which we can bypass the elite and establish, a sustainable form of provision of these services.
What do you think?
One of the things that I've always said is that we have to find a way by which we can empower the poor. The way to empower the poor, one time I met with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and that was way back in 2009, and he asked me, Professor Ayittey, what do you think the U.S. can do to help Africa? And I said, the U.S. doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. All that it has to do is to look at the former Soviet Union and the role played by Radio Free Europe. What Radio Free Europe did was to propagate and establish freedom of expression and freedom of the media. What would change Africa is the same formula: freedom of the media, freedom of expression. Now, if you have that, the poor themselves will be able to express the type of need that they want or the type of development that they want. Right now, they don't have a voice. Nobody listens to them. It's government which decides for them. But then, of course, the government run by the elites, of course, think better for themselves and not for the poor.
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things I want to actually ask you about, and I want to follow up on two points you made, but let me ask the first one. I mean, I think, did you yourself have a problem with freedom of the press? Were you detained or arrested for your critiques?
Oh yeah, I was. My books were banned, and I was trailed everywhere I went in Ghana, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Kenya, South Africa. And I was thrown in jail in Dakar, Senegal. And even my office at American University in Washington, D.C. was firebombed. And, I lost, 80% of the contents in my office. So I'm very much aware of, what the lack of freedom of expression means and intellectual repression, because, like I said, you write something or say something an African government doesn't like, and poof, you're either dead or you're in jail. No, Americans, the West, Westerners take their freedom of expression for granted. But it is very fundamental, vital, and crucial. If we want to solve our problems in Africa, we need to have the freedom of expression so that we ourselves can determine for ourselves what type of solution is good for us. Mm-hmm. Not what the government thinks and imposes upon us. That is very crucial.
Do you think, how are things today? Like, say, for example, one thing I've noticed, so we did Poverty Inc., and I get a lot of people from all over Africa say, we love your film. We love Poverty Inc. It's great. We've been waiting for somebody to say that. And of course, your work, right? The work of, say, Dambisa Moyo, the work of Andrew Mwenda. There's a growing number of African voices who are very critical of the foreign aid element and the kind of planning. And then, of course, also in the United States, people like William Easterly and others have been critical. Do you think is it better now than, say, it was in the 80s and 90s? Oh
yeah. I mean, it's much better today than it was even 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Now,
go ahead. Yeah.
Now some of us, despite all the persecution, have been able to raise enough stink that it is, shall we say, not judicious for African governments to go after critics, although still they now do in terms of going after opposition leaders. I mean, if you take Paul Kagame of Rwanda, for example, I mean, if a dissident or critical, Kagame assassinates his critics even when they are abroad. So that is not something that, we cannot take freedom of expression for granted in Africa.
Yeah, one thing that's been interesting in in this freedom of expression, there also seems to be, I don't know if this is right, so tell me if this is wrong, but that the dominant models of development, right, of like aid or central planning, there seems to be a rising critique from African economists, entrepreneurs, but there seems to be resistance, not just from African leaders, but also from kind of Western development experts. I think there was a debate where Bill Gates, if I'm not mistaken, he was very critical of Dambisa Moyo, saying that her ideas, I apologize if I don't get this correct, but almost saying that her ideas were evil, right? Not that she was, but their ideas were. And so there seems to be this kind of tension going on between, say, a lot of African voices and elites in the West as well, who want to keep the dominant model. Do you think that's correct? I mean, I think it's changing. I think there's a lot of positive hope out there. I mean, I think your work, like I said, Mwenda or Dambisa Moyo, William Easterly, Poverty Inc., right, our film, that would have been like not even listened to 15 years ago. And now people are listening. So I think that there's positive elements, but there seems to be this tension even among kind of like the development experts. What do you think about that?
Well, it's, I think there is a perception and it's grown out of the, shall we say, altruistic reasons, that motivation that, people like Bill Gates feel that, it is morally right to help Africa. And I mean, I don't question that impulse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, it is very noble on his part, and also on the part of many NGOs. But somehow, I don't know, the way things are set up in Africa, they feel that the way for them to help is by working with governments. That is where, the connection is, they feel that they don't want to rock any boat. Mm-hmm. And they don't want to go into, say, Nigeria, for example, and then work with the people because they might be perceived to be subversive or anti-government, or working with what you might call rebels or whatever. So they feel that it is safe for them to work with governments to help the Nigerian people. And I think that's where you still have this lingering effect that government still plays an important role in development. Don't get me wrong. Yeah, government has a role to play in development. But then you have Westerners, like Bill Gates, and also Western charities that feel that sort of feel that, the best way of helping the African people is to work with their governments. And this way they reinforce the notion that government planning and government programs do work, and in an indirect way underwrite and provide support for socialist policies that ruined Africa in the 1970s and 80s.
Mm-hmm. So it's a kind of a older model deal. I think I want to move from this to actually where the informal economy. So I'm kind of rushing us through, but I think it's an interesting just point with government that in one sense, government absolutely has a role. There needs to be clear rule of law. You need to have clear title to your property. You need to be able to participate in the formal economy. But it seems that a lot of the help doesn't go to creating the foundational, like say, institutional infrastructure.
No, not at all.
Instead, it goes to like projects, and that's
yeah, precisely.
Yeah. So, please.
Yeah, precisely, and that is where I think like I told former Secretary of State, that is where the aid is most needed. Set up aid that helps establish, let's say, something like freedom of expression, freedom of the press. For example, the U.S. could say that, look, we're not going to give aid to any African country that does not respect freedom of expression or does not have free press or free freedom of exchange of ideas or information. Or we can say that, look, we don't want to give aid to any African country that does not have an independent judiciary or an independent central bank, for example. So these are all very important. In other words, the aid is directed to establish institutions. As a matter of fact, former President Barack Obama said precisely that. When he came to Ghana in 2009, he said, Africa doesn't need strong men. It needs strong institutions. But then the U.S. hasn't helped Africa to build these strong institutions.
It kind of, it kind of reverts back to the normal model of, let's do projects.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think there's a recognition that institutions are important. I mean, like you just said, President Obama said it. I think, Acemoglu and Robinson have written about this but of course, Douglas North and so many people, and Peter Bauer. I mean, this is not a new idea, but it seems it's very hard to shift the way we think about aid to institutions. I want to move on here. I know there's so much we could discuss on all these areas, but we only have a little bit of time left. So I want to at least get to this point. And one of the things that you talk about is the informal economy. So you talk about, the informal economy is all these small groups that they're not registered. And so in one sense, it's a real problem because they don't have access to credit. It's hard to get their court cases heard if there are contractual elements, difficulties or struggles, but that there's all these bakeries and tailor shops and bicycles and food and all these groups. And you say this sector constitutes about 70% of Africa's economy, right? It's a large employer, and there's all this entrepreneurship, right? There's all this, in a sense, hidden capital, like that Hernando Soto writes about. So I want you to maybe explain a little bit of why the formal economy is so important, but also one of the things that we've talked about is, if you look at like graphs of employment and GDP, it's the small medium enterprise sector that's such a force for OECD countries, but it's really missing in much of sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America. So can you talk about why the informal economy is important, and then maybe what could work, what would be important institutionally or politically and socially to allow that hidden capital of the informal economy to really create economic growth and increase prosperity for poor people?
Well, as I indicated or written about, if you take any African economy, it is made up of three sectors. There is the formal sector, which is based in the urban areas. The formal sector is where you have wage labor. You purchase things and you get receipts back, and you have things in paperwork and that sort of thing, regulations and so forth. And then at the other extreme is the rural sector, where you have peasant farmers producing, let's say, corn, for example. And in between these two sectors, you have the informal sector. The informal sector is something like a transitional sector where people are moving from the rural areas to work. And that is where you find the vast majority of the poor people in Africa. Now, that informal sector, it is actually indicated, it comprises of bakeries, tailor shops, bicycle repair, and food vending, those hawkers, street hawkers, and so forth. That is the sector that's bustling with entrepreneurial energy. And I've always argued that this sector could serve as the engine of growth for Africa. Why? It is because it employs almost 80%. It constitutes almost 80% of the economies of many countries, even in South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana. Almost 80% of the sectors constitute the informal sector. So if you want to lift the poor out of poverty, the way to find the poor is to go to the informal sector and the rural sector. That's where you concentrate your development efforts. But these are precisely the sectors which the ruling elites neglected. They channeled much of the development efforts into the formal or the urban areas where they lived. Like Ivory Coast, for example, 70% of the development that occurred in Ivory Coast is concentrated around Abidjan. That is the formal sector. Now, if we want to pull the informal sector out of the doldrums and let it serve as an engine of growth, what we have to do is to find out what the informal sector lacks. It lacks clean water. It lacks electricity. It lacks basic credit. Simple credit, not, I will call it mesocapital, not microcapital, mesocapital.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I'll explain it in a second.
Yep, very important.
It lacks, or what you might call, healthcare facilities. And, you know, the informal sector is comprised of markets. For example, go to a market in Africa and you see people going up and down and very much engaged in hustling and bustling, but let it rain and the market becomes so untidy and smudgy. Of course, you can improve upon the market situation by building a better market with stalls, for example. And you can rent the stalls to the market women, charging them something like $100 a month or something like that. In other words, you can improve upon the situation in the market, cover it so that when it rains, the place doesn't become so muddy and so forth. And you can provide, say, toilet facilities to the market and clean water to the market. You can improve upon this kind of situation in the market. This way, you'll be encouraging growth in the market. And this is one of the ways by which you can let the market serve as an engine of growth. I'll tell you what, there was a market in Nairobi. Now, in 1992, the government cleaned up the market and they sort of killed more than 400 rats from the market. And that was the first time they had cleaned the market since independence in 1967. So a new outlook, a new outlook towards improving the informal sector will help a lot in improving the lives of people, the poor, in the informal sector.
So, no, I think that's very interesting. So we're towards the end, and I would like to ask, you've mentioned, I think, a new outlook. You just said, mentioned new outlook of helping the informal sector. We talked about institutions and freedom of the press. And one of the ways we have to empower the poor. So maybe just like one or two more examples, I think would be good. Like people are always thinking, what are some ways to help? How do I get in? How do I help? And, there's opportunities for innovation. What would you say? So we've talked about kind of macro ideas. The government aid needs to help build institutions. What about, say, either non-government, like NGOs, or maybe for-profit approaches to really empower that informal sector and rural, where the poor are? What would you say, like one or two just quick ideas before we finish?
Well, some of the informal sectors have leaders. And the main thing is to try and find them.
Mm-hmm.
For example, let's take tailoring, for example. They have an association and they find the leaders. Take a market, most markets have what you might call market queens. Okay, they settle disputes and arbitrate anything that goes wrong in the market. Identify them, talk to them, and find out, how we can help the market. And also, not only that, you can levy small taxes on them so that you can collect revenue from them so that the contact is mutually beneficial. We also have the informal sector is also adjacent to what you might call traditional leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the traditional leaders control the land on which some of the markets are situated. Get the traditional leaders involved. I'm trying to think of ways by which we can reach out to the informal sector without necessarily having to go through the urban government, the national government. And then there are also some NGOs that we can reach out to. Some of the NGOs organize, let's say, the poor in markets in terms of, shall I say, small saving schemes that can raise, a little bit of credit for them, revolving credit schemes. And there are also some, shall I say, bank officials who have also been trying to reach out to informers, so people in the informers. We can also work with them. But the main thing is at least try and establish some kind of contact with them and find out exactly what they need. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure, I bet that they will need clean water, electricity, healthcare, and also access to some basic credit, at least, and make their environment more sort of livable. When it rains, for example, the informal sector is just an eyesore, muddy and very dirty. We can start cleaning it up and make it even more livable.
Great. Well, Professor Ayittey, there's so much we could follow up on. We're out of time. Thank you very much for first of all, just many years ago, doing the interview for Poverty Cure and for Poverty Inc., for your insights today, and just for your work, and I think bringing clarity to think about these problems and really setting out the importance, as you did, that after independence, there wasn't economic freedom, there wasn't political freedom, there wasn't freedom of the press, and that it's growing, but there's still so much work to be done. And I think thinking about the importance of the informal sector. So I really appreciate your being here as part of the Poverty Cure Summit, and I hope you'll come back and talk to us more.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you like to hear more of. If you're familiar with our past content or have attended an Acton event and would like to see it in a future episode, you can email us at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Vault, I'm Gabriel Jaja.